Okay, so let's pick up then with looking at how it is exactly that these social relationships that we just talked about visualizing in the last lecture, how it is that these social relationships actually come to influence our health, right? So you might be familiar with the Beatles song, "We Get By with a Little Help from Our Friends." That's helpful for our health. So let's look at the ways in which that actually happens. So, networks represent our social relationships. We talked about that last time. So, really, the question is how is it that social relationships affect our health? I'm going to outline 4 different ways. The first is through exposure to behavior, right? You've seen this in the Thompson article called social contagion, and the kinds of health outcomes that um, might do or pick up through social contagion might be happiness or smoking or obesity or suicide. We'll talk about that in a second. The second way that social relationships and networks influence our health is that they provide access to information. So they give us what's called social capital, and I'll define that for you in a little bit. They give us access to information about our health behaviors, and they provide weak and strong ties for us, which then provide us with different kinds of information and resources, which then influence our health. Third, our social relationships provide social support. So that could mean emotional support, like somebody really being there for you when you need somebody to talk to, a shoulder to cry on, somebody to be happy with. Or social support can also look like people supporting you with things that you need to do. You have tasks that need to be done, you need to go somewhere, people who will help you do the things in your life that you need to do. And the last way that I'll talk about, and actually, I'm going to refer you to the video on Blackboard that I've posted. It's a TED Talk called The Secret to Living Longer May Be Your Social Life. This 4th point, social integration, gets at how dense, right, like tightly packed, how well connected or cohesive is the network, how well connected are people within the network, and how integrated is a single person into the network. So you can think about social integration from an individual level perspective, like how well integrated is a single person into their particular network or community. And then at an overall level, how well connected are all of the people together? Is it pretty dense, like everyone knows everyone, or is it a loose network where you have, a couple of ties connecting people? One person knows this other person and they know this other person rather than everybody knowing each other. Okay. So we'll start with exposure to behavior or social contagion, right? So relationships matter because they expose us to health behavior. Obviously, the term contagion or contagious might make us think about biological contagion, right? Like, you have the flu, don't come near me, you're contagious, I don't want to get the flu. That is not what we are thinking about here. This is not about biology. This is about social relationships and how the social aspects of our ties and relationships with one another influence our health, okay? And so the idea of social contagion is that if we are exposed to a particular behavior or attitude, we might think, well, that person thinks this or does this, and so I can do this or think this too. Okay? So it's the idea of contagion is literally that we see somebody doing something and we're going to do it too. Okay? So, but this happens differently for different kinds of health behaviors. So, one way that contagion works might be through peer pressure. This is probably the case for smoking or drinking, particularly among the teenage years, but probably not the case for obesity. We're probably not peer pressuring each other to eat a lot of unhealthy food. We're probably not peer pressuring each other to be happy. That's probably not the way those things work, but certainly that might be the mechanism by which our social relationships influence our behaviors like drinking or smoking. If we have shared environments, we might be equally likely to have a particular health outcome. So if we all live in an area where there's no access to fresh food, that's going to have a similar impact on our health just by virtue of being in the same area. If we have shared activities, right? So again, with drinking and smoking, if you're hanging out with people who are doing those things, you might start to do them too. It might influence our health behaviors because of homophily, which I talked about in the last lecture. This tendency for us to interact with people who are a lot like us. We might actually choose people to associate with because they do the kinds of things that we do. So again, if you think of like smoking and drinking, I keep coming back to these examples, but if we choose to hang out with those kinds of people, that shapes our network, which then can reinforce those health behaviors. And then the simple act of contagion comes up in the happiness article. So sometimes it really is the case that just being around that happy mood is contagious and it makes you happy too. There might not be some other kind of social mechanism there. So I put 2 videos on Blackboard for you that are talked about in the happiness article. One is about, they're both videos, are very short, 2 minutes, about health in social networks. And they both come from a study that was done by researchers named Fowler and Christakis. And they did a study of health over like 30 or 40 years in Framingham, Massachusetts. And so one video looks at how people's levels of obesity in this social network change over time. And you can start to see like how the network connections matter, how the ties matter. And then a similar video about smoking behaviors in social networks. So they're very quick videos. You should take a look at those to see how it is that they're very short videos. So you should take a look at those to see how social networks can influence our health. Okay, so I also had you read an article about adolescent suicide. And the data that they're using here comes from the high schools that were used to create the network images that we saw in the last lecture. So the network drawing of sexual and romantic relationships, and then the network drawing of friendships. So this comes from that larger study. And what they're doing here is they are looking at 2 different outcomes, okay? So they're looking at suicidal ideation, which basically means the extent to which you think about suicide. Do you think about suicide? Have you ever thought about committing suicide? And then actually attempting suicide, okay? So I'm actually going to pop over to the article itself to just sort of walk through what those tables look like, because I think they can be a little confusing if you've never looked at something like this before. So this is the Suicide and Friendships article, and I'm just going to scroll down to the tables. So this is just descriptive information about each of the variables that they looked at. But I'm going to focus first on table 2. Okay, so it's kind of long. We'll get to that. This is an analysis looking at how all of these factors on the left impact suicidal ideation, thinking about suicide. Okay, so I have highlighted the factors that are what we would call statistically significant. And as I put a note about this on Blackboard, but basically anytime you see a number that is lower than 1, that means that that particular factor has a negative impact on the odds of thinking about suicide, meaning that if that is true of that person, they're less likely to think about suicide. So for example, for girls, okay, you can see that this is less than 1. So this has to do with the density of the school network, meaning that they're looking at whether or not, or how densely connected the school's social network is. And so what this tells us is that the more densely connected the school is that a person attends, if they're female, that has a strong negative impact on their odds of thinking about suicide. They are much less likely to think about suicide when the school network is densely connected and cohesive. Everyone has ties to each other, everyone knows each other. Maybe not everybody's friends, but it's certainly a close-knit community. Okay, so that matters for girls. Then if you look down further, you can see, I'm going to skip over family and household, but really quick, these numbers indicate that the more distant kids feel from their parents, the more likely they are to think about committing suicide. If there's a gun in the household, the odds are higher, right? Because these numbers are above 1. The odds are higher. And if somebody in the family attempted suicide, then for males and females, the odds of them thinking about committing suicide are also higher. But I want to point your attention to 3 numbers here. Well, 4. So these 2 here refer to a person's position in a social network. Okay, so this number here refers to how isolated somebody is in their social network. And again, because it's highlighted only for females, that means that it's really only a factor for whether or not female students would think about committing suicide. So what this tells us, because again, it's above 1, it's a number that's greater than 1, the more isolated a female student is, the more likely she is to think about committing suicide. This here, the intransitivity index, you'll see defined over here on the right-hand side. Intransitivity means that you're friends with people who are not friends with each other. Okay, that's not a very cohesive social network. If you're friends with people who don't hang out together, who don't talk to each other, who aren't friends, then your social time is sort of split up among those people. If that's the case, the more that's the case, again, the higher the likelihood is that females will think about committing suicide. And then what's really powerful are these numbers here. If you have a friend who has attempted suicide, you are more likely, males and females, okay? You're more than twice as likely to think about committing suicide yourself, okay? So if I go back over here, again, this was suicidal ideation. So for girls, thinking about suicide is less likely if the school has a dense or close-knit friendship network. Both girls and boys, males and females, are more likely to think about suicide if a family member or a friend has attempted suicide. And for girls, thinking about suicide is more likely if they're isolated from social networks in their school or if they have friends who aren't friends with each other. So you can see that in the red, right? If a family member or friend attempted suicide, that's something that gets at this idea of contagion. I see somebody else do it, now I'm thinking about doing it too. The blue, right, so this and this, have more to do with how well integrated the community is as a whole and how well integrated individual people are within that community, okay? If you then go back, and we won't walk through this whole thing step by step, but if you then go back to look at table 3, this is looking specifically at suicide attempts. So no longer just talking about thinking about suicide. This is now students have actually attempted suicide. Okay. You can see that there are fewer numbers highlighted here, but some of the same things pop out. Density has a negative impact. The more dense the network of the school, the less likely students are to attempt suicide. For males, if there's a gun in the household, they're more likely to attempt suicide. And that is a gendered dynamic. You don't see that number highlighted here because in general, males are more likely to use guns when they attempt suicide than females are. You'll see that a person's isolation or the extent to which their friends are friends with each other no longer matters when you're looking at suicide attempts. But again, having a friend who attempted suicide does. So to go back, we're looking at suicide attempts. This is less likely to happen for males and females if the school has a dense friendship network. So having a well-connected community is actually a protective factor for suicide. It helps protect people because that means typically people are looking out for each other. Suicide attempts are more likely to happen if someone's friend has attempted suicide because that's red. Again, that's a contagion issue. That's an exposure issue. And suicide attempts are more likely for boys if there's a gun in the house. So that's an example of how contagion works. You've read a couple of things. You know, there's a lot of talk about contagion in the happiness article. I will point out that I posted a article about a high school in Cleveland who has now seen its sixth suicide attempt. Sorry, it's actually sixth student who has died by suicide. And in that community, they're really talking about this as a social contagion issue. So that's an article that I've posted in the additional resources section of Blackboard. Okay. So the second way that relationships matter is because they influence our capital, in particular, what's referred to as social capital. So social capital is the resources that are accessed by us individuals through our social ties. Okay, so it's about who you know. So let me give you some examples of how this happens at the individual level. All right, so first of all, this happens because we get access to jobs through our social ties. So that's a resource, right? Employment is a resource. And the extent to which we're able to get employment through our social connections, that's part of our social capital. Okay, so this really connects back to the Erickson article where she talks about weak ties versus strong ties, right? If we're looking for jobs, it's more likely that our weak ties, people that we know through somebody else that we're acquaintances with but not really close friends with or not family members with, that's really where a lot of the variety of our access is going to come from. And then you can think also of immigrant networks. So when somebody comes to the United States, for example, or any country, but if somebody comes to the United States and they already know people here, they are able to join that social network, which already contains many resources that they can use to get a jump on their life here. So if they have people that they know, or even people that they know through somebody else that they don't know intimately, they can use those connections to get a job, to find an apartment or somewhere to live. Sometimes they can expand a business franchise. Essentially, they're getting resources through those connections, and those resources have implications for their health because we know that they're part of socioeconomic status, and we know that socioeconomic status has an influence on our health. So that's one way. Social relationships and social capital influence health because they also give us access to health-specific resources, not just socioeconomic resources, but health resources. Okay, so this is in the Gangler article, right? They talk about help getting an appointment or getting a good physician, basically knowing people that can help you as you navigate the medical institution. Okay. Social capital also improves our access to health-related knowledge. So knowledge is actually an example of a different kind of capital. It's called cultural capital. So through our friends and through the people that we know, we're not only getting things, right, appointments, we're also gaining knowledge. That knowledge is cultural capital. And I think that this is referred to specifically in one of the readings as cultural health capital. So you could think about it that way too. So this would involve knowledge of the medical system, right? The institution of medicine, or knowledge about behaviors that are healthy. That might be an example of health literacy. Our social networks can provide us knowledge in the form of values and norms, right? Things that We learn from other people. These are the important things that you have to know about health. You can't eat gluten, or you can't have sugar, or you can't eat fat, or you have to work out 30 minutes a day. We learn these things through our social relationships, and those crystallize into health lifestyles. Okay, so we don't just pick up our health lifestyles out of nowhere. Those are formed through the knowledge, the values, the norms that we gain through our social relationships. And our knowledge about health also influences how we use our economic capital, right? Our money. How we use our money for health purposes. So, are you going to spend your money on booze, on cigarettes, on weed? Or are you going to spend it on a gym membership? Are you going to spend it on Blue Apron, right? How are you going to spend your money in a health, and how do those decisions about how you spend your money impact your health? At the community level, we think about social capital in terms of the level of civic engagement in the community. And what I mean by that is, to what extent are people in the community actively involved in its operations, right? Are they voting? Are they involved in, the government? Are they involved in community organizations? Are they bowling together? Are they in softball leagues together? What kinds of community and civic membership and what level of engagement of the people who live there is there? Now, the extent to which people in the community are involved in these kinds of activities, that influences the mobilization of resources. So the more involved people are in the community, the easier it will be for that community to mobilize resources when something happens. If, let's say, somebody in the community passes away and the family cannot afford funeral expenses, or if somebody is very ill, people may be able to more easily raise money in a community that has a high level of civic engagement. So the third way that relationships matter for our health is that they provide us with social support. In the research in sociology of mental health and in psychology identifies two different kinds of social support. Well, actually three, but we'll just talk about two of them here. One type of social support is what we call instrumental social support. And this is essentially this is when we receive help with tasks. When we're ill and we need somebody to come and help us clean the house, or we need somebody to help us pay our bills, or we need somebody to help us get in and out of bed, or take us to the doctor, or something like that. That's instrumental social support. In contrast, emotional social support is the support that helps us feel that we are loved and cared and listened for, and listened to. And this is one of the things that gets at the core of human beings. We want to be connected. We seek connection. And that social support, that emotional support, is so critical to feeling that sense of belonging, and thus has a really important influence on our health. So social support can have direct or indirect effects on health. And the way that social support influences health actually depends on the quality of that support. So if you have social relationships where you feel loved and get the help that you need, that can have a positive influence on your health. It can reduce your blood pressure. It can reduce your stress. It can also buffer or sort of mitigate or lessen the impact that other stressors have on your health. So not only can social support help you avoid stress, but it also helps lessen the impact that other existing stressors have on your life. However, if you have toxic social relationships, they are more stressful and they can contribute negatively to your health. They can increase your stress level, they can increase your blood pressure, and they can exacerbate stressors that you already have. So imagine if you are fighting with your parents or your friend and you're already stressed out about school. Those things are going to compound and multiply to affect your health. Whereas if you have great relationships with your family, you have great relationships with your friends, and you're feeling stressed out about school, they can help take some of that burden off you just by listening or by bringing you something to eat or whatever the case may be. So there's a trend that sociologists have identified that over time, the number of people that we have in our lives that we can discuss important issues with, right? The number of confidants that we have has declined pretty dramatically over the years. So one study in particular looked at the number of confidants that people identify. How many people in your life can you say that you can talk to about really important things that are going on? Not everybody in our life is like that, but how many people can you, if you had to talk to somebody about something important, how many people could you call? In 1985, only 10% said they had nobody to call, but that number increased to 25% in 2004. And that number is even a little bit higher now. And what's even more striking is that not only has the number of people that we can talk to about important things declined, but the vast majority of the people that we identify now are people in our family. So we're not even having as many people outside of our family. Sometimes you got to get outside of your family. And that is much less likely to be the case now than it used to be. This is also a reflection of our declining civic and community involvement. The more involved we are in our communities, the more likely we are to have ties outside of our family. And so we're seeing a real decline in community participation, which means that we're just less likely to have people in our lives who are not in our families. The really crazy thing about the research on social support is that it shows that the social support that we think we receive is actually more important for our health than the social support we actually receive. This is a really consistent finding, and it kind of blows your mind, but it really illustrates this idea that's central to sociology, that if we perceive something as being real, it has a real consequence on our lives. So if we think that we've got people in our lives who support us, whether or not they do, that's sort of not the issue. The issue is if we think people are there for us, that's going to have a positive impact on our lives. The fourth way that relationships matter is because they provide social integration. Okay, so in general, the more integrated we are into our social network, the better our health, typically. But think back to week 1 when you watched that video about Durkheim and his suicide study. His research showed that if somebody is feeling over integrated, like everybody's watching them, that may have an impact on their likelihood of committing suicide. So social integration is great, but it can have downsides if it's too overbearing. And rather than talk about any research here, I just want you to watch Susan Pinker's talk on the importance of social integration. So this is based on a book. She's a psychologist, and the talk that I posted on Blackboard is based on her book called The Village Effect. So I'm going to let her speak for herself. It's a great talk. It's really interesting. And this will get really at this idea of social integration. So in sum, social relationships matter for our health. And this robust, consistent finding is probably because they influence our health in multiple ways at the same time. So what that means is that it's really difficult to tease out exactly what it is about social relationships that matter. Oftentimes, as I've talked about in this lecture, it's going to depend on the type of relationship that we study, and it's also going to depend on the type of health issue that we look at. So that's it for week 3. I want to encourage you to watch all the videos. They're really good, especially I think the network obesity and smoking videos are super fascinating. So I hope that you enjoy all of that. Have a great week.